Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astle's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, I'm taking more questions from listeners. That's right, it's another episode of Question and Astle. Let's begin. Well, welcome to another Q&A episode, another episode where I'm taking questions from you, the listener. If you want to check out previous episodes of Question and Astle, go back and take a look at episodes 8 and 14. Some of today's questions were actually topic submissions that I wasn't quite sure would make a full episode, though I might always reconsider that and come back to them later. There are some topics that you could adequately cover in a few minutes, but you could also talk about all day. So who knows? Before we get into it, this is your reminder to share and subscribe, share this episode, share the show with somebody you think would enjoy it, and make sure you subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast. You can also submit questions for future episodes of Question and Astle on our website, which is bonuspointspodcast.com. So, without further ado, let's get into our questions. We have a good selection today. So, first question. What do you think of conspiracy theories, and do you believe any of them? So it's helpful here to define our term first. When we talk about a conspiracy theory, the most basic sense of what that term means is it is a theory. It is, a theory. It is a claim that claims the existence of a conspiracy, which is an agreement between two or more people to do something illegal. So in the most basic, most literal sense, a conspiracy theory is just any theory that claims that two or more people agreed to do something illegal. And so when you define it like that, obviously there are all sorts of conspiracy theories that are 100% true. The first one that came to my mind, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that was a conspiracy. A group of people got together and decided, and they agreed to do something illegal. So, if you are claiming that the the assassination of the Archduke was a conspiracy, by definition, you are claiming a conspiracy theory, and that one is obviously true. Now, I say that, but when people usually use the term, they're usually using conspiracy theory to refer to like an alternative explanation of a historical event. They're saying that the reality is at odds with the official story or the commonly believed story. And usually they'll say that the official story or the commonly believed story was deliberately promoted by some group in order to hide the truth. So there's something nefarious there. There was some intentional attempt to hide reality. I also think there are plenty of those out there. There are plenty of recorded instances where there was deliberate misinformation, even by our government. That's not crazy to say. There are plenty of historically verified cases where different groups, including our government, deliberately promoted misinformation to hide the truth. If you want to check out more specific ones, check out Jimmy Akin's podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Among other mysteries, he often looks into historical mysteries, including conspiracies. So I linked to, in the show notes, I linked to, I think it was the episode on the JFK assassination, because he addresses, that's one of the most well-known conspiracy theories, and he does a lot of really good research there. So, if I'm remembering right, and this question was submitted a while ago, but if I'm remembering, the person who submitted this question wanted me to mention some specific conspiracy theories that I believe. Because I just said, I do believe that some of them are true. Now, I'm sorry to disappoint you if you're disappointed by this, but I don't believe a lot of the big name conspiracy theories. I do believe that we landed on the moon in 1969. I don't believe that Freemasons control the world. And I don't think the Jesuits control the world. Actually, the example I was going to use of a conspiracy theory that I believe, I'm actually not sure if I believe it now, and it's precisely because I wanted to do some more in-depth research to prepare for this episode, and I think I may have been convinced. So, the example I was going to give of a conspiracy theory that I believe was the New Coke conspiracy. So, what this theory claims, back in, I think it was the 80s, don't quote me on the year, Coca-Cola, in an effort to continue competing with Pepsi, discontinued what we now call Classic Coke and replaced it with a new formula that they called New Coke. The new product was a tremendous failure. People immediately said that it was not as good. They didn't want it. They wanted old Coke back. And so after a few months, Coca-Cola discontinued New Coke and brought back what they called Classic Coke. Now, that's the basic story. The conspiracy theories all claim that in some way or another, this was deliberate, that Coca-Cola knew that New Coke was going to be a failure, but they did it anyway for some reason or another. There are different explanations. The one that I'd always believed was that this was a way to hide the transition from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup in Coke. That Coke wanted to switch from using real sugar in their recipe to using high fructose corn syrup, but they were worried that people would notice the difference, and so they needed a way to get all of the Coca-Cola off the shelves long enough that people would forget what it tasted like. They discontinue it, they put out New Coke, everyone hates it, they discontinue it, they bring back quote-unquote original Coke, and they could have switched from sugar to corn syrup without anybody noticing. I believed that conspiracy theory for a while, and then I started to do research specifically for this episode. So if you had asked me even 2 weeks ago, hey, do you think New Coke was a conspiracy? I would have said absolutely. Here's what I learned, and here's why I'm starting to doubt that theory. 5 years before New Coke came out, Coca-Cola allowed American bottlers to substitute up to 50% of the sugar for the cheaper high fructose corn syrup. It did not happen concurrently with the return from New Coke to Classic Coke. In fact, 6 months before New Coke came out, those American bottlers were allowed to use 100% corn syrup in place of sugar. And in fact, by the time New Coke was released, most American bottlers had made that switch entirely to high fructose corn syrup. And so that kind of makes that conspiracy theory fall apart, because having New Coke to disguise the transition would not work if the change happened after the transition. Now, my source for all of this was Snopes.com, which is not as unbiased and objective as they would like you to think, but this particular article seems trustworthy to me. It's well cited. I was able to corroborate the timing of the switch from other sources as well. So I'm not one of those people that thinks Snopes is the bastion of truth to always be trusted, but in this particular instance, I'm convinced by what they found. Our next question is another interesting one. What is in the Vatican's secret archives? This is a good, this one kind of follows from the last one because there are many conspiracy theories about the Vatican's secret archives. Let's start with some background. In Vatican City, there is an archive, a collection of records that for the last few decades was referred to as the Vatican Secret Archives. Now, a few years ago, Pope Francis changed its name to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. Not many people followed it one way or another. I still hear people call it the Secret Archives. Technically, though, it is the Apostolic Archives. And unlike some of the other curial name changes that have happened recently, I'm actually in favor of this one. I think that the Apostolic Archive is a better name because, as you'll see in a minute, it's a better reflection of what the archives have always been about. And the word secret took on a new meaning that made it more confusing. So, like any archive, the Secret Archive, I'm going to keep calling it the Secret Archive, at least for this episode. It's a repository of information. It is a collection of records. Primarily, this is where the records are kept for any official act of the Holy See, which is just another way of saying all of the Pope's actions and all of those actions done in the Pope's name. The records for that are stored in this archive. It also contains correspondence, account books, all sorts of documentation that the Vatican has accumulated over the centuries. Originally, it was part of the Vatican Library, but in the 1600s, Pope Paul V separated the archives from the library and made it its own organization. This brings us to what used to be its name, the Secret Archive. In Latin, The official name for the archives was the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, which we translated as Vatican Secret Archive. Now, in everyday use nowadays, when we use the word secret, when we say that something is secret, we mean that it is restricted or hidden or confidential or clandestine, for my eyes only kind of thing. But in this context, the word secretum would perhaps better be translated as private or personal. This referred to the fact that the contents of the archives belonged to the Pope personally. It did not belong to the Holy See or the Curia or any specific group in the Vatican. Other groups in the Vatican have their own archives, You have like the Secretariat of State. They have their archives for all of their documents. The secret archives belonged not to any given department, but to the Pope. And when one Pope switched to another Pope, the new Pope would inherit that archive. And so it was called the secret archive to reflect the fact that it belonged personally to the Pope, not that it was hidden or scandalous or the way we would say top secret. Even back when it was called the secret archive, it was open to researchers. Now, when you think about it, this is not something that the Pope would be obligated to do. After all, these are his personal archives. But most popes would allow researchers, some more than others, to access the documents in the papal archive. So typically, researchers are able to access everything except for any pope whose reign ended in the last 75 years. So if you look 75 years ago, who was pope at that time, anything from that pope to the present is off limits. Anything from before that pope is generally accessible. The reason for that is because that's a long enough time period that there could still be people alive that would be impacted by what's in the records. After all, a lot of the Pope's personal communication is in there, including things that were written to him. So for the sake of those people, more than anything, the most recent popes are generally off limits, but there are exceptions. For example, the records of Pope Pius XII were opened early, especially in order to understand better his role in the Second World War. So, what is in the Apostolic Archive or the Secret Archive? Lots of documents, many of them boring and routine. If you are a history nerd like me, you would probably find more of them to be interesting. But again, just from a historical perspective, not from any kind of conspiracy theory perspective. Some people think that the Vatican's hiding proof of aliens or like proof that that Jesus never came back to life or like something that would be earth-shattering. Probably not. And I did link an episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World where he does address some of the more specific theories that people have claimed about what's in the archives and why, sorry to say, most of them probably aren't true. There are plenty of interesting things in there from a historical perspective, but nothing too scandalous as far as we know. Our next question is another common conspiracy theory. I should have just called this episode Conspiracy Theory Q&A. This one, were Jesus and Mary Magdalene married? This one is a common conspiracy theory that was made popular, especially by Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, and the subsequent movie. This theory claims that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were actually married, or at least were lovers, and that the term Holy Grail refers to their offspring, that there is a direct line of offspring of Jesus and Mary Magdalene going down to the present day. Why does this matter? Well, for one, the church has always made it clear that Jesus was celibate. And so many of the proponents of this theory, they want to say, if the church got this wrong, what else did they get wrong? And so this theory can be used as a way of undermining the church. Is there anything to this theory, though? Let's look at the evidence. So we're going to start with the evidence that is often claimed to support the Jesus was married theory, and then we'll look at evidence against. So the first piece of evidence that proponents of this theory will cite is they'll say that celibacy was not practiced in Judaism in the time of Jesus, and so it would have been weird if he wasn't married. Here's the problem with that. Celibacy was only rejected by later Judaism. In the time of Jesus, it's not perfectly clear how often celibacy was practiced, but we do know it was more than zero. It may have been rare, but it was not unheard of. For example, not far from Jesus, we have the Qumran community of Essenes. They're the community that made the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were a celibate community. So it is probably true that celibacy was not super common for Jews of Jesus' day, but by no means does this mean that it was unheard of or that it would have been out of the question for Jesus to be celibate. Now, here's the big one. Proponents of the Jesus was married theory will often cite quote-unquote lost gospels that will refer to Mary Magdalene as the wife of Jesus. Problems with that. These quote-unquote lost gospels say a lot of things. They also say that as a child, Jesus smited a kid because he messed with his clay birds. So just on the face, these lost gospels, they say a lot of stuff. There's a reason we don't take them at face value. Now, every so often, especially if you are watching the History Channel around Christmas or Easter, you'll hear people refer to these gospels called the lost gospels. They talk about it in the same way they talk about lost manuscripts of authors, like, oh man, there's more. Like we just found new stuff, new books of the Bible. A couple problems here. Even though these people will call them the lost gospels, they were never lost. The church has always known about them. And we looked at them, and the church looked and said, no, these are not inspired by the Holy Spirit. And so they were rejected from the canon, even way back in the 4th century. We more properly would refer to them as Gnostic Gospels, because a lot of them were written by Gnostic communities that held these Gnostic views that are not compatible with Christian teaching. And so, based on what we know about these documents, most of them were written much, much, much later than the canonical Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John sometime in the 1st century, whereas these Gnostic Gospels, even though they're attributed to people like Judas and Mary Magdalene and Thomas, they were not actually written by these people. They were written at the earliest, probably in the 2nd century. And so the church has always known about these documents and has always said they're not inspired by the Holy Spirit. We're not saying there's nothing good in them or that they don't preserve any genuine traditions. We're just saying that they're not on the same level as Gospels, and especially the further down the road you get, the less and less reliable they are. So when we actually look at the first century and a half, whether we're talking about actual New Testament documents or not, in that first century and a half, we don't have anybody referencing Mary Magdalene as the wife of Jesus. So, what evidence do we have that Jesus was celibate? First of all, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, never refer to a wife of Jesus, and you would expect them to. If Jesus was married, the Gospels probably would have mentioned her. The Gospels refer to his mother, his foster father, other relatives. We hear that Peter's married because the Gospels mention his mother-in-law, but no wife of Jesus, which you would expect if he was married. We hear at several points Jesus talks about marriage. He's very clear in his teaching on marriage. If he himself was married, you would expect him to mention her. Again, it's weird that he talked about marriage and never brought her up. And then later in the New Testament, St. Paul talks about marriage and Jesus, and he doesn't talk about the wife of Jesus. In fact, he refers to the bride of Christ, but he's talking about the church. If he had a human wife, first of all, this would have been a strange comparison to make, but he definitely should have mentioned her there. So the fact that this wife of Jesus is not mentioned anywhere is pretty good evidence that she doesn't exist because he was celibate. Now, you might be thinking, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, just because she wasn't mentioned, that's not proof that she didn't exist. That can be true. It is true that in many cases, evidence or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. However, it is worth considering in cases where we would expect to see evidence. in the cases I just listed, if Jesus was married, we would naturally expect a mention there, but we don't get one. Our last question for today, what is the deal with indulgences? Oh man, I love this one. So indulgences are one of those topics that can get people really fired up, especially when there are misunderstandings about what an indulgence is and the role that they've played in church history. So if you were to just ask random people, the people that would attempt a definition would probably say that an indulgence is like a get-out-of-hell-free card that the church sold back in the Dark Ages as a way of making money off of honest, hardworking Catholics who wanted to buy their way into heaven. So, right from the start, I want to make it clear, the church has never approved selling indulgences. There are certain members of the church, including pretty high-ranking members of the hierarchy, who did sell indulgences, especially in the early 16th century, but this was never something that the church supported. Based on our understanding of what an indulgence is, that would completely preclude the idea of selling them. And so as soon as it became an issue, the church was quick to condemn it very, very strongly. So even though you'll hear people say the church sold indulgences, that was never true. People in the church wrongly sold indulgences, and the church was right to point out, hey, that's not good, don't do that. So, indulgences are a thing we believe in, but we don't sell them. So what are they? For this, we need to back up and talk about sin. So, when we sin, we act against God and His will. So it makes sense that every sin is going to affect our relationship with God. Right? We call this the eternal punishment for sin because it affects our relationship with the eternal God. This is the quote-unquote punishment for sin. This is the effect of sin that is healed when we receive absolution in the sacrament of confession. That eternal punishment for sin is gone. Our relationship with God that was broken is now restored. But sin often affects more than just our relationship with God. Sin hurts other people, it damages us, it weakens our virtues, it makes us more prone to vice. This we call the temporal punishment for sin, because these are the effects of sin that we see in the temporal world, the world of time that we're living in today. So I'm going to make an analogy. Let's suppose I have a box of cheeseburgers that I got for one of my classes, but you come into my classroom and you eat all of them. On one level, our relationship has been damaged because you did something that I didn't want you to do. And so this is like the eternal punishment for sin. You also probably have a stomachache because you just ate all of those burgers. That's like the temporal punishment for sin. Now, let's say you come back later and you apologize and I forgive you. Our relationship goes back to normal. But you still have a stomachache. So let's say you lay down for a bit, then you do some exercise to work off those calories, you buy me new cheeseburgers to replace the ones you stole. Now, not only have you repaired our relationship, but you've also repaired some of the other effects of what you did. This is how we think of penance, right? So you go to confession, you receive absolution, that eternal punishment for sin is wiped away, but you're also given a penance. You're given something to do to make up for the temporal punishment for sin. This is why penance is so important. We go out of our way to repair the effects of sin in the temporal sphere by cultivating virtue, by training ourselves, by doing things to try to heal those effects. Again, our relationship with God is good. It is healed in absolution. But we also need to heal that temporal effect of sin as well. This is where indulgences come in. An indulgence is when the church specifically promotes a certain act of penance or certain prayers and basically points out, hey, these acts have value when it comes to helping us grow, when it comes to helping us heal the temporal effects of sin. And the church will say, some of these actions will help with part of that, others will help with all of it, what we call a plenary indulgence. But they're not magic. They're certainly not get-out-of-hell free cards. They're not for sale. Indulgences are spiritual practices that help us repair the temporal effects of our sins. So that's going to do it for today's episode of Bonus Points. What resources do I have for you today? Well, I'm linking to an episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World where he talks about the JFK assassination, if you're interested in his take on conspiracy theories. I'm linking to that Snopes article about the New Coke fiasco. I'm also linking to Pope Francis's motu proprio. That was his declaration that renamed the Vatican Secret Archives as the Vatican Apostolic Archives. I'm linking to another Mysterious World episode about the Secret Archives, a Catholic Answers article, Was Jesus Married?, and the 25th session of the Council of Trent. The third decree addresses the sale of indulgences. So make sure, as always, that you share this episode with someone who would enjoy it, share the show, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out our website, bonuspointspodcast.com. In just a few weeks here, hard to believe, we're going to be back in school, back in the classroom, and so I'm looking forward to a new year, a new season of Bonus Points. I haven't yet decided if I'm going to actually make a new season. I don't really know what that does, but yeah, we're starting over again, right? We're jumping back into another school year, and it is going to be an exciting one. So to all of my listeners, whether you are one of my students or not, keep enjoying the summer. We have some time left, but I'm also, I'll see you soon if you're going to be back in my classroom. That's it for today's episode of Question and Astle. I am Mr. Astle. Thank you for joining us as we continue every episode to put out into the deep, exploring the world of theology and beyond.